Hello, I'm Carolyn Brecken, Chief Curator at the Autry Museum, and I have the pleasure to be talking with historian and author Sherry Smith about her newest book, Bohemians West, Free Love, Family, and Radicals in 20th Century America. Sherry Smith is Distinguished Professor of History Emerita at Southern Methodist University. She is a past president of the Western History Association and has several award-winning books to her name, including Hippies, Indians, and the Fight for Red Power, and Reimagining Indians, Native Americans Through Anglo Eyes, 1880 to 1940. Her most recent book, Bohemians West, is a great story that explores love, sex, politics, power. Sherry, how would you try to summarize your latest book for all our listeners?
Well, those were good words to start off with, for sure. The heart of the book is actually a love story, a free love story of a couple that met in 1910 in Portland, Oregon. They were introduced by Clarence Darrow, a famous lawyer, and they began an affair. They were both married to other people. They both had children, but they began an affair that began in 1910, and it lasted for the rest of the man's life. He died in 1944. And so it looks at a really interesting, long-lasting, radical relationship that is very deeply archived, and there's lots of information about it because these two people, Charles Erskine Scott Wood and Sara Bardfield, who are known among some people in Western history, but are not super famous in the bigger scheme of things. They kept a very long correspondence going over the years that led to 2,700 letters just between the two of them. Much of it is about the relationship. So on the one hand, this story provides, I think, a fascinating tale of how these two very interesting people met, fell in love, and how they negotiated the rest of their lives in terms of their relationship to one another, their relationships to their spouses, and to their children. But beyond that, it is also a story of the larger context of radicalism in America, including in the American West, because both Erskine, who saw himself as he defined himself as a philosophical anarchist, and Sara Bardfield, who was an ardent feminist and suffragist, but also a Christian socialist, were very much involved in many of the larger political issues of their day relating to labor and certainly imperialism overseas, and in Sarah's case, suffrage. So they're going back and forth between the times when they get together and are not writing letters to each other, but the many long periods of time when they're apart and involved in other aspects of their lives, including their radical interests. So there's an opportunity here to look at radicalism in a sort of granular way, first in this intimate relationship, which was far outside the boundaries of a normal love affair as understood in the early 20th century America, but also to look at how they actually engaged in the radical politics of their time. And then finally, the story demonstrates how they had political conflicts within the relationship, how those were worked out over time, and the relationship between the intimate politics and the larger politics of which they were engaged, how those things interrelated in the story as well. So it's about power, it's about love, it's about sex, it's about change, it's about family and heartbreak, it's about self-realization, self-sacrifice, all those big human elements and themes run through the story.
And I love how you pull out through this relationship how love is always personal, political, and philosophical for them. And you really show how complicated relationships were and are and can be. And you use this wonderfully evocative phrase in introducing the book about the radical politics of intimacy. And so, I'd love to hear a little bit more like how you found, as you were diving into this deep archive, the many words that, these couples exchanged, how that political and personal liberation went hand in hand for Sara and Erskine.
Okay, well, for Charles Erskine Scott Wood, he was a radical in lawyer's clothing. He led a very conventional life as first an army officer and then as a lawyer. But in his soul and in his spirit, he saw himself as a free spirit for whom personal liberation was the highest sort of value and goal in life. Even though he had married, he had a conventional life in Portland. He had children who were grown by the time he met Sara, but he was never happy. He felt he was not being able to realize his authentic self. So he was striving to achieve his authentic self through in individual freedom his whole life. And so by the time he meets Sara, and he was 58, she was 28, there was a 30-year difference. He had this very well-honed philosophical idea about free love. And that was what he thought was much more appropriate way in which human beings, and he was thinking men and women, should engage in relationships with one another, which put freedom, individual freedom at the highest point. And that the purpose of love, of course, was when you shared it to come together. But if it ever changed, if one person no longer felt that love, then it was incumbent upon the other to give that person freedom. So this was a very this is something he'd written about publicly. He was known around Portland as a man who engaged in affairs outside marriage, but also would not necessarily flaunt that, but he would certainly flaunt his ideas about marriage. When Sara met him, she was married to a Baptist minister. So she had not thought very much about free love, but she also shared a dissatisfaction with her life and frankly with her marriage. And so when she met Wood, and they shared many things, including political values outside of the question of marriage itself, a love of poetry, when that relationship began to blossom, she accepted and engaged and embraced Wood's philosophy of free love. And actually, she was the one who acted on it first and much more dramatically. And she really leaped off and left her husband and her children for this man, hoping that he would come and join her.
And I do love that you give significant space as you draw in the story to kind of not just the ideals of free love, but kind of the messy reality, diving into what divorce meant, what it meant for child custody, the power dynamics that kind of constantly shifted back and forth between the two of them, and especially kind of the consequences for in the early 20th century for women to pursue radical ideas of personal freedom and politics.
Well, in those letters, they work out a lot of these issues. And sometimes it seems like they are writing about free love philosophically as a way to justify their choices. And that's what many people, I think, conclude this is all about. I actually think they genuinely believed it. It was not simply a crutch upon which they were justifying their actions. But it was not all it was cracked up to be, as one of my friend's grandmother who read the book said, free love wasn't all that great, wasn't all that free. There were issues, of course, and some of the disagreements that they had, even though they shared the same goal and a long-term hope to live together as a free love couple, was when was that going to happen? That was one of the big questions and points of division between the two of them. And secondly, what about the issue of monogamy? And so Wood, as won't surprise your listeners, did not really believe in monogamy. And Sara wished that they could have monogamy within the context of their free love affair. So those were some of the things that they were thrashing out in the course of their letters and then working out over the course of time. And as I've already indicated, Sara was the one who first, she had left her husband. She knew she was risking loss of her children by doing that. Clarence Darrow was advising her that maybe she could still get a divorce and get the children, but that was not going to be. So she was the one who was taking the greater risks. She was the one who did, in fact, lose custody of her children once the divorce was finalized. And in the meantime, she's waiting for Wood to extricate himself from his family and come and live with her. So, and he will not be budged until he has received a big windfall from his law firm, which will free him up to leave a very nice trust fund for his wife, who will not divorce him, and to his grown children. So he had familial obligations that he was going to meet before he would actually leave Portland and join her down in California, where she had gone to live. As far as the other cost to Sara, she did not seem to care one whit about what people thought of her. She didn't care about losing social status. That didn't matter to her at all. She found in Erskine all she wanted in life, actually. And so she did not go around parading being an advocate of free love. She did not write about it in the way that Erskine did. Neither did she hide it. She was pretty much content with the life with him and the wonderful friends that they had, very interesting friends that they had, from Clarence Darrow to Robinson Jeffers later on in life. So they had a very rich social life. But if she would have suffered scorn from more conventional society, she didn't care about that.
What did it mean for you to try to come to terms with the emotional reality of their lives, not just their political actions? In some ways, sometimes you feel like a novelist as much as a historian, having to kind of grapple with kind of the emotions that seem to kind of always be bubbling up around this
Well, it
couple.
does feel like a novel. It reads like a novel, people have told me, and I'm kind of happy to hear that. But the thing that makes it so interesting is it is not made up. This is all very much rooted in reading
Yeah.
many, many letters and trying to be as honest. I think they were trying to be as honest as they could be in their letters. So sometimes they reveal themselves to be not very likable and to make choices that I know people will not find very attractive. But I guess I could not have done this and spent so much time with them if I didn't have some part of me that liked them at times and that sympathized with their dilemma. So for me, it was a fascinating story. In the end, I do not judge them. I don't like them or dislike them in a way that I often find people who I talk about the story with or who have read the book have very strong reactions to them. I am stepped back from that, and I must have liked them enough to do this, but it was to me very fascinating how it was working out over the course of time. I will say one more thing about this. I went to a writers' conference once, something I never did, but this time I was trying to write not a book of scholarship for academics, but a historical story that would compel readers outside of academia, as well as hopefully some academic people. And so I went to this little conference, and there was a wonderful nonfiction writer speaking. And so I asked the question, do you have to like the people you're writing about? And his answer to me was, you don't have to like them, but you have to love them. And
Hmm.
I understood immediately what he meant. Which I think what he meant was you have to sympathize, empathize in some way, understand that these are human beings with all the flaws that we all have, who are trying to live a life that's meaningful to them without causing harm to others. And I think both Sara and Erskine believed that that's what they were trying to do. Although my story reveals that they did cause a lot of pain to others and sometimes to each other as well. So this was not without cost to a lot of people, the choices that they made to be together.
And I think for me, what made them compelling was that you included their imperfections. So these aren't
Yeah,
historical figures that you're putting on pedestals at all, which
right.
I think makes them more human.
Yes.
But they did have significant both political and personal imperfections, and where their personal values often fail to match up with their political ideas. And so,
Yes.
what did kind of studying these two people so closely show you about the limits of their radicalism?
Well, there were some things I would not give up. And so for Erskine, I do believe he truly sympathized with labor. And he was fiercely anti-imperialist. And some of the listeners may know of him, his role in the Nez Perce War. At the end of that conflict, he befriended Chief Joseph, got to know him, sent his son to live with him, and so on. Was quite sympathetic even during the course of the war with the Nez Perce people, and was not happy with being part of. He didn't use this term at the time, but an imperialist force. So I do believe his sympathies were legitimately radical, but he also loved fine things and he loved beautiful things. And so he did become a lawyer in part so he would have the money to buy fine things and live a beautiful life. And so for some people, how could you call this guy a radical when he was wealthy? And how can you call him a radical when he was very generous, but he also kept a lot of money for himself? And his answer to that, because he was called on this in his own lifetime about, aren't you being a hypocrite? You're not a bohemian, you're a rich guy. You're not a radical, you're a lawyer. And he said, look, even radicals need to have lawyers. And so, you need somebody like me to be writing in these Portland periodicals from a radical point of view, who's a person that the white middle class will listen to. So he believed that he was not compromised by his lifestyle choices, but not everybody will buy that, that's for sure. In terms of Sara, the really interesting thing about her was I totally believe she was a feminist. She was very, very involved in the women's suffrage movement, but her ultimate goal in life was to live with Charles Erskine Scott Wood. So this was the thing that mattered more to her than anything else. And so that seems like maybe sort of a contradiction. She truly became an independent woman. She was a feminist. She would challenge would in the context of their relationship for power. But in the end, all she really wanted to do was live with this guy, and so that's sort of an interesting, not contradiction, but paradox, maybe.
And it is a different story about women's suffrage than you might expect, in the way that the personal and politicals, as you say, continually are mixed in their lives, as probably in most of our lives. And that her suffrage was an expression of her commitment to radical politics, but it was also a path to self-awareness and kind of employment.
Yes.
So she had many reasons for why she was embracing the movement as well.
Yes, definitely. I mean, that is absolutely the case. She gets involved in the first place in Oregon in 1912 as a way to get out of the house. By this time, the affair is, going on. Her husband doesn't know it yet. But by joining the suffrage, and this is the state suffrage in Oregon, by joining that campaign to stump the state, she was actually able to leave her home for long periods of time and go out to Eastern Oregon in particular to stand up on cars and address people on street corners about why they should support women's suffrage. But it's in the course of doing that she gets greater confidence in herself and a greater understanding that she has to be who she is, which means she has got to leave her husband and try to create a new life with Erskine Wood. So those things are absolutely together. And as later on in life, when she's down in San Francisco, waiting for Erskine, she joins the National Women's Party and has an incredible adventure where she drives this petition, which is signed by Western women voters, as well as men voters, taking it to the East from the West, demanding a 19th Amendment. And she drives across the continent with these other two women. She didn't go, however, until Erskine gave the okay. Here we have this sort of hedging. But it was that adventure as well, which really bolstered her self-confidence in who she was and who she was becoming. In the story, she changes more than Erskine does. She was younger and still in the process of discovering who she really was. And she believed that with Erskine, she was finding that person and that he was supporting her in that.
And again, you uncover these, as you could call, mixed motives, but at the same time that, she is most well known probably today for that cross-country trip to carry the petition of Western voters to Congress. But again, we might not realize how radical that is today. And that, Sarah was also part of a much more militant phase of suffrage.
Yes, exactly. Well. The most militant phase of that, of course, comes with the picketing at the White House and then the women who were arrested for obstructing traffic and then thrown into jail and then some of them force-fed. And Alice Paul, who was in charge of this whole thing, wanted Sara to do that too. But Sara wouldn't go that far. She did not want to picket the White House and go to jail and be force-fed. So she drew the line. She drew the line there. But nevertheless, it's at that moment, actually, this is one moment when Erskine and Sara are in disagreement about politics. And that was that he thought that these militant tactics were counterproductive, that they should be more sympathetic to President Wilson's situation. And during wartime, they shouldn't be doing this. And she just couldn't believe he was saying this stuff to her. And so she was saying, look, I'm bigger than you when it came to this. But behind that was not only, I'm bigger than you in terms of understanding the necessity of forcing this amendment now, but I'm also bigger than you in our personal relationship because I have taken all the steps required to free myself and wait for you. And I'm still waiting for you. So once again, the political and the personal are totally intertwined there.
It was a wonderful channeling of Sara, her voice there. Yeah. So, just to think about, so how, after living with them for so long, writing about them, studying them, how do you hope we remember them? What do you ultimately feel their legacy is?
I think the value in looking at their story is in just not only understanding, maybe getting a better insight into what it was like to live in these radical years in the early 20th century, really fascinating time. I think I would have enjoyed living there and being part of this myself. It kind of reminded me of the 1960s. So I do think that telling their story gives you an on-the-ground, sort of more emotional connection to what people were trying to achieve and how they were going about it. But I also think the value comes in looking at this story, and I think inevitably, people have told me anyway, that it causes them to reflect on their own lives and their own choices that they make. because so much of this is sort of everyday stuff, like who do you marry? And what if you've married the wrong person? And what if you find the right person? And what are the consequences for children? All of those things, the sort of personal agonies and moments when they had to make choices, are things that are very familiar to a lot of readers. So it's not meant to be a model of how to do it at all, right? But it's just to watch and see how they did it and what the consequences were, and maybe be kinder to yourself, actually, if you have some feelings about some of the choices that you have made, or maybe you'll feel better about yourself because you didn't handle it the way they handled it. But I think it does. In the end, I think that history and novels are both about human behavior and what people do, what the choices we make, and the emotions and the rationales and all those things. That's what makes us human and what makes it interesting. So I think their value in the end was, I think they tried to be honest. And I know there were times when they were lying. They were lying to each other. So I don't mean they weren't never lying, but they were trying to keep this record. And that was a very conscious choice that Erskine made early in the relationship, by the way. He told Sara to save every letter that he sent her, and then he would keep the ones that she sent him, and they would keep them because he was pretty sure that someday people would want to know what pioneers in free love went through. So it was a very conscious choice that they made to keep these letters so that somebody like me would come along with the time and the inclination to read them and tell their story. So they wanted to speak to people 100 years later about what it was like 100 years ago. And I would say, sadly, in some respects, it's not all that different. We still have many of these same dilemmas and conflicts of the heart that they had 100 and some years ago now.
Well, I think you just wonderfully proved his point about why those letters mattered, why their story mattered. You talk about the deep archives for this story. And I know that those archives actually exist down the road from the Autry Museum at the Huntington Museum. So tell a little bit about how these letters were preserved and how you came to first encounter this couple.
Well, both of them were literary figures in California. They were both poets and published poets. So when Wood died in 1944, Leslie Bliss from the Huntington Library swooped down on their home, which they call the Cats near Los Gatos, and wanted to acquire the literary materials, first editions of their books, but then eventually he moved on to talk about their literary archives. And they, as I indicated, had many very famous friends, including literary people. And I think that he had in mind getting the correspondence of famous people. But in the end, these letters between the two of them were also sent to the Huntington. And so that's how they ended up being there. Sara would later kind of regret that they didn't go to the Bancrofts in Berkeley, because that's where her daughter lived and her son-in-law taught. I was happy that it was here at the Huntington because it's such a great place to work. And I was lucky enough to get a one-year fellowship that gave me the time to read all these letters. And it's not only the letters between the two of them, but with their spouses, with each other's spouses, with the children. It's just incredible. That's how I got to know what the implications were for the families, because they kept every letter that they got, as far as I can tell, every single one.
Unlike in our age of text and emails, where a lot of this kind of correspondence is being lost.
I know, it's sad.
And I just want to encourage everyone to go read the book. You can purchase it at the Autry Museum store. You can go online, obviously, and purchase it. But it's a wonderful, as you said, intimate look at the heady time of politics and how it's interrupted with personal relationships. So again, thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate sharing
it.
us.
All right.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.